Meeting in Aapresid's 28th Congress, where our motto is Forever Life, Forever Green. Today is Friday, August the 27th, and we will start with the last part of this plenary session. The speakers will be Mr. Ridigoras and Ms. Papendiek. The speakers will talk about how to meet the environmental requirements in food production all over the world. During the presentation, you may pose your questions or write your questions in the question box on the right of the screen. At the end of the presentation, we will make the questions or as many questions as we have time for. Please write your questions during the presentation. At the top part of the menu, there is a section called Participants, where you may talk to the lecturers, interact with them, and even organize meetings or set up meetings for later on. Visit the Congress website, where you will find many interesting materials and resources to learn what is happening in the social media. Follow the hashtag Aapresid Congress and in this way you won't miss anything. I will briefly introduce the speakers. Sabine Papendiek has a degree in political sciences with a major in international relationships, and she has a master in international economic relations granted by Barcelona and San Andres University. She's a consultant in the area of market access issues. She provides consultancy services to the private and public sector and international agencies. She has published several papers on worldwide food trade. She works Her work is focused on the international requirements and guidelines for food trade. She works at the National Program for Carbon Neutral Production. Mr. Idigoras has a degree in political sciences, and he has a master's degree in business and administration from Belgium. He's the chairman of the Argentine Oil Association. He's the main researcher of GPS, the director of the Study Center of Food Products of University of Lomas de Zamora. He has been an official in the Argentinian government for 17 years, representing the country with the European Union. He has been an agricultural attaché, and finally he's a graduate professor at two university, and he has published several papers on the issue of international food trade. So let's start with the presentations. Thank you very much, Julian. Thank you for inviting me to be a lecturer. I'm always pleased to participate in Aapresid annual congresses and to share with you my vision on this issue. The environmental issues and themes have been part of Aapresid's continuous agenda, and it's actually the first arena in Argentina where we have been able to discuss this issue and to make progress in environmentally related issues. Aapresid launched the first national program on certified agriculture, which we tried to get acknowledged in Europe as the first environmental standard coming from a Latin American country. That's why I think this is the right time to talk about the evolution of the environmental themes, but relating it to markets. You know that agriculture in Argentina, especially agriculture of large grains, soybean, corn, and wheat, is closely related to access to international markets. we are competitive based on international price and on our capabilities of reaching several markets. That's why it's important to analyze what those markets are doing, what they are thinking, what they are planning to do, what they are doing today, so as to adjust to that, not only to stay in those markets, but to grow in those markets, to grow market-wise, profitability-wise, with the use of new technologies, and we want to be able to meet the new requirements. Today, I'm going to talk about environmental requirement as a short-term goal. When we started talking about this 10 years ago in Aapresid, we talked about it as a future, as a thing of the future, but today it's here. It's a market reality, and that's a huge change. We can see nowadays that there is an international scenario where international trade was managed, brokers disappeared, regulations were challenged, and this was negative for our exporting capabilities. And the pandemic is expanding protectionist measures. We talk about two things: environmental issues and sanitary issues. Sanitary issues were because of public health issues, which is a concern for value chains, private and public sectors. But the environmental component goes hand in hand with the first one, because the world is moving towards a scenario of more regulations, not the other ways. The world is not trying to make trade and production easier. It's trying to make these two actions more complex, and it's getting more complex for countries that are able to produce more, to use more technology, and for the export industry. Today, we are making it to over 100 markets, including biodiesel, oil, corn, soybeans. So these 100 markets, most of them are thinking of developing obstacles, additional restrictions that may force us to work harder. When we talk about health and environment and we put them apart, this is a mistake, because when we talk about good practices, environmental practices include good health practices. So we must put both elements together, talking about an environmental component that is more comprehensive, that includes good practices, agricultural ones, and production practices. Here we need private and public sector cooperation, producing virus-free food, something the Chinese started talking about. We are facing increasingly more problems. We have many problems to have access to several markets regarding the maximum residue level. The world is changing in its approach to this issue. We have to work with municipalities to manage these residue levels. But the world considers that agrochemicals is a bad term when we produce food. But we know that we cannot produce food without agrochemicals. But we must find a balance between food production, food security, and health and environmental security required by mankind. So many countries are starting to reduce or eliminate the use of agrochemicals or molecules using new criteria that are totally unrelated to science. And this is an issue for Argentina. Argentina's agricultural system is based on scientific foundations. The non-till approach is a scientific approach, but it's not acknowledged by the world. So we need to pay close attention to this. Besides the issue of GMOs, well, we all know what happens to them, how important they are. But in Argentina, we know that in the next 2 or 3 seasons, we may have new events in the soybean market that are going to reduce the production costs significantly, because there will be plants that have resistance to herbicides. But there are 100 markets that have not accepted the use of such events. So if we use a biotechnology, if it's not liked by the buyers, well, we would miss opportunities in the soybean market. So that's why we have to work closing those areas. Another important theme worldwide, and the discussion is taking place especially in Europe, is this idea of deforestation-free chain. This is being discussed in Europe, and Europe states that the competitivity of the Mercosur is based on these deforestation capabilities. That is, we are very good, our costs are lower because they are not able to fell trees because they have to meet environmental requirements, and that's not the case for us. This is untrue, but it's true from the point of view of the political point of view. So this helps them to set up barriers. So they are talking about the Amazonas in Brazil, about the Gran Chaco in Brazil, as they are analyzing how the Forest Act is implemented in Argentina, how we guarantee that farms in Argentina may guarantee that they haven't deforested, they haven't fallen any trees for a given amount of years. So we are working with international NGOs. Aapresid has participated in this program, and we have been able to show that the deforestation level between 2008 and 2018 caused by soybean is 0.009 in the Gran Chaco of Argentina. However, by European NGOs, the risk of buying soybean and soya byproducts coming from farms that have gone through deforestation is 70%. Why? Because the scientific concept is not there. There are no they're not logical or common sense negotiations. So we must work hard to show, to demonstrate that we are meeting the legislation, that we have value chains that are properly set up. We also have the issue of traceability. It's very difficult to have traceability for commodities such as soybean, but we have to expand this concept because there is demand, so that the pork eaten in Denmark or Shanghai, so that the feed of that pig can be traced back to the soybean meal manufactured in Argentina. Finally, being carbon neutral, well, it's also very important. The world has been talking for 15 years about this. The world talked about measuring emissions. That was important, measuring. But things have changed nowadays. Now we have to measure, but we have to reduce carbon outputs in agriculture. And the non-till system and the non-till adoption in Argentina has shown through international studies that have been validated that Argentina is the country that has the lowest soil erosion rates because of the use of non-till. But we know about this. The regulators in Vietnam, Thailand, Brussels don't know this, are not aware of this, so we have to communicate this. We have to show to them that this is the way it is. So we have to work with programs that have been devised by Argentina based on our production and marketing systems. Environmental standards are becoming increasingly important. In the past, it's only the private actors who were interested in this, especially large retail chains. But later, slowly, countries began to regulate this. They started by regulating the issue of biodiesel. We had to design a system, the IPA soya bean, so that we would be able to export biodiesel to the US. But Trump decided that our biodiesel was not good, so it was rejected through arbitrary and discretional steps that are not legal. But we are still left with a European market that has set up some requirements, and we are meeting those requirements nowadays. We are meeting the requirements of the European market, so we sell 1 million tons of biodiesel based on soybean to the European Union. However, the number of private standards has increased significantly, and they are all different, and they all have different certification requirements. Today, the world is is trying to find a way of substituting private standards for public ones. How to change this willingness of applying the standards to turn them into something mandatory. Up to now, this was all only a matter of choice. In the future, it will be mandatory. I won't be able to sell if I don't meet the standard. And this is a paradigm change. Aapresid has been talking about certified agriculture as one tool, a choice. But in the short term, if we don't meet certain standards regarding environmental good practices and good production practices, we will be kicked out of the markets. And we should start working on this right now, thinking not only about the near future, but we should also try to adjust to the new requirements. Finally, some items to be taken into account, because sometimes we say these are the crazy people in Europe who are always trying to kick us out of the market. And again, they have thought of something new, a new crazy idea, which is called the Green Pact, the Green Agreement. That is, they want to be the leaders in environmental goods. That's how they have launched the Green Pact. They are working a lot on this. There was a picture taken in Brussels today by all prime ministers and presidents in Europe. They have ratified that this Green Pact should be implemented as soon as possible. They are going to invest 100 billion euros to turn the European economy into a green economy. But it's not only soybean and soybean meal that will be affected. The beef we sell through the Hilton quota, the pork we will be able to sell after signing the agreement, the European Union, dairy products, we will have to provide traceability for all those products, and we'll have to meet certain certification requirements. Biodiesel. China has already launched its requirements regarding carbon footprint. They are asking for information to set up a standard. You know that China is the major buyer of soybean in the world. Vietnam is the main trade partner for Argentina. The Hanoi harbor is the first export harbor for Argentina. It has taken the first position from Rotterdam. Today it's Hanoi. And Vietnam is changing its legislation. We have been negotiating with them for 60 days, and they asked for salmonella free products, and they asked for traceability for soybean, corn, and wheat. So we had to renegotiate that, but we have corn that is already growing, and there is a large consumption of corn, and Vietnam is asking for environmental information and traceability for corn. Thailand is passing legislation on chemical residues. In India, we signed an agreement last year to certify sustainability for soybean oil. India is an important buyer of soybean oil from Argentina. So the world is not an European fancy. This is not a European fancy. The world has decided that some requirements have to be met in order to have access to the market. The summary would be we have a chance to become leaders in the process. We may choose. We may be the latecomers with higher costs, or we may become the leaders by adapting our production and marketing systems. We shouldn't miss that opportunity.
A very clear presentation. We continue with the next presenter. Thank you, Julian. I want to introduce the Argentine Neutral Carbon Program. As Gustavo said, this is something we are leading in Argentina to give a response to Europe and other export markets. This program is oriented towards products and to comply with the information and the requirements about neutral carbon. The Argentine Neutral Carbon Program is the result of the fact that we have an increasing population, we have sustainable development goals to meet, and we therefore need to increase food production by at least 60%. And what are markets requiring from us? That food production should be done in a sustainable manner with the same amount of resources or even less resources. So this poses the need to start to work with environmental um, performance indicator and impact categories. We have multiple impact categories. The most advanced standards are working with more than 15 impact standards. We were talking about deforestation, the change in soil use, biodiversity, all these categories. In the case of biofuels, we have been working for a long time now, but we need to try to incorporate it to the other food supply chains. Apart from indicators such as water and toxicity, we have this issue of carbon, which was the first trigger, the first element to trigger environmental impact. So what we propose is to start working with CO2, being aware that there are many other indicators on which to work. For instance, deforestation, as Fernando was mentioned. When we started to talk about climate change and mitigation, agriculture was considered and the blame was put on increasing the emission, and we had to measure in so that people knew that our impact was not that much. But we couldn't manage how to improve that results. And now there is a change that is being observed in the past few years that has already been mentioned in previous Aapresid congresses, and this is to include in the estimation or calculations the carbon uptake that our agricultural system has. The roots of our plants have the capacity to uptake carbon. So the maths are completely different because we don't don't increase the emissions, but on the contrary, we um, contribute to climate change mitigation. How are we expected to work with carbon? At the beginning, we just needed to know how big our emissions they are to measure emissions. The race to zero, we we are running to achieve carbon neutrality, how we decarbonize our activity. We are along this process. In this race to zero, we are including government and the private sector as well, not only the public sector. The private sector has to contribute to this race to zero. If you go to the retailers to buy food products, you will find lots of standards, lot of environment information labeled in the products or in the product packet. So we need to know that information if we want to have our products in that shelf, because this is information that the consumers are demanding. We need to identify where our products, where Argentine products are. So we want to copy these because these buying conditions will have an impact on competitiveness. We need to be used to a consumer that is informed, that is more demanding. We the customer or clients will need to have information about production cost. So what stakeholders think, what suppliers and what customers think, it's a whole chain. And then reputational aspects, which is not a minor issue, because climate change is targeting as a new consumer, a more demanding consumer. So in the past, we were used to see three concentric circles: economy, society, and environment. And today, environment has a larger share. We need to consider the environment, we have to consider society in order to be economically viable. In this context is that the neutral carbon program is placed. This program requires or is the result of the environmental mapping of food and beverage. We need to have a first snapshot in order to know where we are standing now. We need to put in this snapshot domestic data. Sometimes this snapshot, this photograph is not taken with the correct camera because they are using default values, and probably those values do not reflect what really happens in practice. Probably the snapshots reflect the same product we produce here, but produced somewhere else in Europe or in India. So we need to take the snapshot of our own facts of what happens here. We need to validate them, to publicize them or to publish them so they are acknowledged. This is a long way. We have already been working with biofuel. When we started with biofuels, we didn't have real values of what the facts were here. Now we do have them. Now we have to implement this and to certify this. And for that purpose, the program is intended to develop manuals, a calculation sectorial manual that would give us the recipe how to calculate carbon balance or carbon budget in our productive system. 1 liter of oil, 1 kilogram of flour. So this estimation, this calculation will in turn generate more sectorial good practices. So the standards that are valid in the chain are collected, and it also records all the best practices that are already being implemented by our companies, and then benchmark this to what happens globally. This would allow us to improve, to optimize the equation, or uh, that equation can be zero or even better than zero. So we would be able to be part of the carbon trading market, or the carbon market. This has a commercial value which we are not using or utilizing right now. So the program is intended to start capturing these advantages. We want to go beyond the specific concept of carbon footprint, because when we say carbon footprint, we are consider only direct and indirect emissions. But what really we want to show, what are the solutions that the sector is showing. So not only with the direct and indirect carbon, but also we have to work with the concept of sequestration. This snapshot 10 years ago, all the methodologies were quite diverse. They were very different, and the result was not very clear. Now methodologies have been harmonized. There are very few differences now. And now all these methodologies are working together because the idea is to have uniformity, to have consistency. So the in the Argentine systems, we are not tied to any specific methodology. We just leave the supply chains the freedom to use whatever methodology they want. Obviously, we have to make a life cycle analysis that has to do with environmental performance. We also work with functional units. We have a program for, we don't have programs for corporations. We rather have programs on a product basis. And we need to not only measure the environmental impact, but also the scope or the extent. For instance, if we go beyond a specific CO2 equivalent per kilogram, we won't have the possibility to be part of the system. So then the scope of the system, how far we are going. We are food exporters, so the different tables, the different groups can define the scope. We need to be aware of what the scope is from the cradle to the port in Argentina. The interesting thing of this Argentine neutral carbon program is a private program, and this program is part of the grain exchange boards in Argentina and gives us real facts of what happens. We have the grain exchange boards of Buenos Aires, Santa Fe, Entre Rios, and others. So we can work directly with the chains, with the regional economies. In case we can, in this program is inserted in the Buenos Aires grain board, but this can be used by any grain board around the country. We also have a secretariat office, and we have made up sectorial desks, sectorial teams, and they play a key role because depending on the cases that we have, a manual will be drafted. How are these desks made? They can have a membership certificate for each group. We have sectorial groups, and we group with a advisory sectorial group that will draft the good practices manuals and the calculation methods. If you're a member of a group, you have the stamp 1, which means that you are a member, that you are already working on this. All environmental performance includes an important communication element. We need to reach the consumer, and we need to reach the decision-making people in the governments. If I implement the calculation manual that is created in the sectorial group, I will be able to be certified by authorized certifying entities, and I can apply for the stamp number 2. So I can start make the accounting of my achievements. And if I'm able to reach 0, I will then be awarded the carbon neutral status because I've achieved this goal of race to 0. Environmental, all the certifications add value to what we are already doing. in order to develop this, the program have a basis for sectorial manuals, and it also has a basis for certification entities or bodies. So the program does not make a direct certification. It works with certification bodies or certification agencies. What in the past few weeks, our Argentine neutral carbon program have entered into a specific agreement with the Investment and International Trade Agency that will help us in presentation in trade shows where the agency participates. And so the agency is already a part of this program. And a good thing is that all the companies that participate in this program are part of the portfolio for investment funds. So in this way, companies will um, benefit being members because they will have access with green bonds available in the market that can be applied to our companies that are already performing have a approved environmental performance. We know that the result will be very positive. So we are working already with the generation of carbon bonds. uh, Argentina is quite delayed, is quite behind other countries in the world in this regard. So don't hesitate to ask us if you have any doubt. We have already started developing the manual of the oil seeds group, and now we are working on the wheat, corn, and beef sectorial group. But any chain is welcome to join us to participate in this program.
Sabina, you have been crystal clear. We will start with the Q&A session now. The first question is the following one. Aapresid has been working in the development of certifications for 10 years now, and our certifications, our work has been internationally acknowledged. The question is, what will the role of these initiatives be, and why do we need a new manual for good practices? Regarding the Argentine program, it is just a manual that is used to calculate it, to make calculations. All certifications will be harmonized according to the manual. We don't want to overlap this, and we don't want to create a new manual. We know there are many different calculators, some of them are closed, and there are many certifications. We just want to facilitate things so that the whole chain becomes more efficient in the implementation, and of course all the good practices that exceed a carbon balance, and this is a case of certified agriculture. We want to include them in the harmonization of the good practices manual. But today the Argentinian carbon neutral program is focusing on carbon balance only, on improving that result. But we don't want to add more things. We just want to facilitate things, make things easier, so that the different elements of a puzzle which are scattered today could be put together to improve access to markets and to make the implementation easier. May I add something, Julian? Of course. The carbon neutral program, where all exports of soybean meal and oil have signed, where the idea is to get some acknowledgement by buyers so that different markets won't set up their own requirements, their own different requirements. That's why this is not a replacement. It complements what we have, but it tries to achieve something which we haven't been able to achieve yet. We want it to get accepted by the buyers. This is the difference. And besides, it's an important difference because when we work on the basis of the carbon balance, the final certifications, accreditations will be different and our values will be much better. So we will be able to better position our products. Now, thinking about the second stage, the carbon bonds market, the companies that might buy those bonds would be just companies from the bioenergy or food industry or all industries or from all industries. How would this be implemented? The carbon market does not mean that buyers and sellers have to be in the same chain. If we don't, if we are not able to become carbon neutral by yourself, we must make up for, for this from activities carried out by third parties. If you have a wind energy park and you produce bonds, those bonds may be bought by other companies. Many companies have to meet carbon neutral requirements, which they have made according to multilateral agreements or the World Pact. If a company is part of the Race to Zero process, they must make up for their deficit by buying bonds from third parties. Bonds become a good that may be bought and sold freely throughout the world. And somehow, well, how producers think this is a thing for the long future. So how would certifications and prices change for producers or farmers if they get the certifications? When we are implementing a sustainability standard, we must bear in mind that this is a life cycle analysis. So I will work from cradle to grave. So we have to work upwards and downwards, looking at my environmental performance because I must know that the phytosanitary product I'm using plays a role, and the same happens elsewhere in the chain. So the whole chain becomes one element, and in the past we got pluses because we were trying to work with certified partners, but now we find that being certified is not a specialty anymore. It becomes sustainability becomes part of this commodity. It's not easy to understand, but this is what the markets are asking for. They want sustainability to be a sine qua non condition to buy or sell goods worldwide. Gustavo, you said that 10 years ago, many of the ideas you had or the forecasts you made are a reality nowadays. Thinking 10 years into the future, tell me about two things that, or two or three things you would like to highlight, areas in which we should start working. It's a good question. I'm working on what happens every day, which is quite difficult already. But if we have to think about the future, about the long term, clearly you have to work on having this idea of carbon neutrality widely accepted and adopted. And it won't be easy. Early on, there will be a transition with trading opportunities. For example, if we had to supply 5.5 million tons of soybean oil with a sustainable that is sustainable way to India, and the production has to be carbon neutral. So we should buy soybean from farmers that meet those requirements, and those that don't meet these requirements would get a lower price for their products. Some transitions will present opportunities, but it should be understood that those opportunities are not there will not be there forever. There will be there just for a short time. But I think carbon neutrality is one important issue. The second important area is emission reduction goals. We are building manuals, processes, certifications, deployments, but it's not something static. It's not that we may take a picture and that's it. It will be a selfie on my phone. No, it's a picture that changes continuously, and in the next few years, in the next 10 years, I will have to achieve reduction goals because of marketing requirements and also because of regulatory requirements, because of the Paris Treaty that has been signed by Argentina, where for the first time we don't have to do anything because we have biodiesel and bioethanol. But if we don't amend the law, there are two sectors that will have to change, that is soybean and beef production. Otherwise, those two sectors will be penalized. So we have to think of reduction goals regarding carbon emissions.
It's very clear. One of the questions that came up in Congress about IT, not about crops. Did you consider production as a whole, regardless of the product? I think that the important thing to consider is environmental performance. Is there is a feedback between one can see the environmental performance from the productive point of view or a corporate point of view. What is the environmental performance of my company, of my factory, of my farm? But we can also consider this, consider the performance by product. These are two points of view, but there is a feedback between these two because if I consider the environmental performance of a product, I can make some estimations to deduct what is the environmental performance of the company. But it is important to see the environmental performance of the product because the product is what we export. We are not exporting a factory or exporting a farm. And mm, and when you want to export a product, when you have to pay duties for that, you won't use the environmental performance of your plant or your factory. You need to give specific information about environmental performance of your product. So there are two sides of the same coin, but as this program is oriented toward export, it's not only that we want to comply with environmental management, but also we want to be in the radar, we want to be in the view of importers of our products. So we want to go to enter specific markets. That's why we are focusing on the product, but they are not opposed systems. Um, Otherwise, information won't be valid if you want to export.
Algunas de las cosas que
Thinking about some of the themes mentioned during the pandemic, well, people talked about the Chinese investments in pork facilities in Argentina. Now, if we will have more environmental regulations in the future, Will it be possible for foreign companies that are more regulated in their markets will come and invest in Argentina? Or what might happen? The point is, this has been widely communicated, the possible or prospective Chinese investment in Argentina for pork production. When we analyze what the governments are discussing, we realize it's an investment of Chinese capitals with Argentinian farmers, Argentinian genetics, Argentinian development, etc. So, a priori, this would be a positive synergy for the Argentinian agri-industrial ecosystem. When we look at the technical requirements that should be applied to the farms, we are talking about the circular economy, basically, where there will be lower emissions based on the proposal that has been received by the Argentinian government. Argentina needs those links or those relationships to attract investments, but we also need legal certainty, macroeconomic certainty, so that those agreements will actually take place. That's why I believe that agreements such as the Mercosur agreement will promote European investments in our Argentinian ecosystem. If we have trade agreements in place, this will bring investments to the agro-industrial sector in Argentina, as the Chinese might be interested. Should there be a long-term trade war with the U.S.? So that's why the China is looking for new vendors. See what's happening to beef exports. So this is something good for China. It would also be good for Argentina because we will have more investments. But in order to achieve this, we need clearly defined environmental rules and regulations. If those don't come from the public sector, well, they should be set up by the private sector. All the value chains for oil, for wheat, should take up their own rules, set up their own rules, and this creates previsibility, foreseeability. Another question for you, Gustavo. You talked about this agreement between Mercosur and the EU, and this is related to what Argentina said about the Argentinian carbon program. What are the remaining Mercosur countries doing regarding carbon? Is there any coordination among the countries to work on this issue?
That's a good question. We are longing for that. We want to promote that. Sabina talks with partners and Mercosur colleagues so that we all have the same. Because if 4 countries in 10 years will represent 50% of agricultural commodities trade, and each of us will compete among us to see who is the greener, it's likely that we will go out to the market, all of us together. It, we are promoting this idea. We have presented this in the Agriculture Southern Council that is made up by agricultural ministers. We have suggested this in the World Trade Organization, in the IDB, and other international agencies. But still, there's some way to go. We have to be convinced that this is not a differential competitiveness value, but rather it is a collective regional competitiveness issue. We don't have to quarrel to discuss because of this, but rather we have to agree on this. I think that we have been working on this panel for 1 hour already. We need to continue thinking. Do you have any final thought to contribute, Sabina? Do you have any final thought to close?
When we started working together, Gustavo and myself, like 15 or 20 years ago, Gustavo was still in Europe and I was still studying at university. we started working on the carbon footprint issue, and we would talk to farmers and business people, and we had to explain to them what the carbon footprint was. And we told them about the life cycle analysis, and looked like it seemed to be like a dark science, but little by little, production sector and the food production sector has taken this up fully. When we go to the farms, to the orchards, to the facilities, when they finally understand the concept, they realize how much they may contribute. We always remember a case of carbon sequestration we had in one sector, which is still striking nowadays. So we produce in a sustainable fashion, but the rest of the world does not know about this. We are not good at communicating it, so we have to work on this. And the Argentinian carbon neutral program that is working through the GPS, it's a program that was created in the region, and it was devised after an early analysis of all the markets, all the requirements that are in place, and taking into account all the standards in place. So we looked at all the positives, all the advantages. It's a very good program, and both the public sector might be involved, the private sector might be involved as a main actor. We are working with the financial sector. We are promoting exports, so there are associations, research groups that are part of these commissions. The idea is to expand, to improve, and we are working to get better. We are working with the standards because we want to communicate the good things that are being done in Argentina, what our contribution may be to the environmental performance. And we are not explaining and see that value. We must consider environmental performance as some added value from the origin. So, Gustavo, if you would share some closing remarks.
I want to thank Aapresid this invitation. I hope that this has been of your interest. We are persuaded that Argentina is a country working under sustainable operation. As Sabina says, we have to show this. And showing this is not only saying that, but also doing it. And this carbon neutral program is a way to do it so we can industrialize this and can reach all the markets you wish to become a supermarket of processed food products. We need to show sustainability, and we have to incorporate it not any longer as an intangible value, but rather as an economic value. In our everyday working matrix, we have to incorporate this as an economic value. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, for the quality of your concepts, and for your time. We are following you. Thank you very much. Now we will close with